In this video, I will show you how OAuth works, OAuth 2.0. We will go through the scenario using different authorization types, grant types, and also discussing the difference between a JWT and an opaque token. We will go through the entire workflow for different kinds of applications using different types of tokens, and we will try to explain each and every step of it. And we will also see how this works in the real world using something like Google OAuth authorization server. So first of all, let us see what are the parties involved in the authorization process. So first of all, we have our client. Now we also have a client, which is basically the user using the internet or some type of application. Now this user is interacting with a user agent. In most cases, this is going to be a phone, computer, or any type of device with which you are interacting with the application. Now, this user agent is interacting with the application. Now, there are two entities that are going to be on our backend. First of all, we are going to have an authorization server. So I'm going to mark this with AS. This authorization server in our example is going to be Google. Then we are going to have a resource server, which I'm going to mark with RS. So the difference is pretty simple. The resource server is the server that is going to provide the functionality to our app. So basically this is just the API. If our application is a calendar app which maybe saves and retrieves files, this is going to go directly to a resource server, which is going to have a database in behind which it is communicating with. And we have our authorization server, in this case Google, which is going to take care basically of the entire authentication flow. So first of all, we will need to do a request from our client application to our authorization server. And please note that also by this step, we will need to provide a client ID and client secret. I have brought up the documentation from Google with the different URLs you can use in order to authenticate your application. So first of all, we have our authorization endpoint. Then we have our device authorization endpoint, token endpoint, user info endpoint, revocation endpoint, JWT URI endpoint. So different authorization servers are going to have a different structure here. For example, if you go to Google whilst using the Google authorization server, you will be able to see all the parameters you need to present while accessing each and every of those endpoints. So now that we know that we have an authorization endpoint, I'm going to call this auth endpoint. So this is going to be basically our first call where we are going to provide a client ID and client secret. So how do we get the client ID and client secret? For that, we need to register with the Google authorization servers. So in this case, you will need to go to the Google Cloud Console and create a new project there and generate a client ID and client secret. This is so that Google authorization servers know which client is calling them. And for each application, you would need to have a different client so that Google knows that. Now we come to different grant types. So the grant types are basically going to be different flows in which we can authenticate our application. So in case we're using a device like a smartwatch, it's going to be the device grant type. In case we use an application that runs in the backend and not in the browser, we are going to use authorization code type. And in case that our application runs in the front end, so in the browser, we would also use authorization code with pkce, so pkce, which is just an extension that uses a code challenge and a code verifier. So in this case, we are going to get returned an auth code. So this is basically a redirect. So what we are getting returned is a new URL, including the authorization code. So this is going to be a URL structure, including the authorization code as a parameter. What we are going to do after that is going to call another endpoint here, which is going to be token. So after this, we are going to call our token API, in which we are going to provide the access token the client ID, and the client secret. In case we are using pkce, we would also provide the code verifier. So in that case, we would use the code challenge in the first step and provide the code verifier in the second step when calling the token here. After this call is successful, we are going to get our payload back, which is going to contain the token ID and our access token, depending on the user rights and the scopes that we have provided. After that, we can call our resource server with our new token. So let us distinguish a few things here. First of all, the types of tokens that we retrieve. We can retrieve a JWT token or an Opaque token. The difference is the communication between the resource server and the authorization server. If we retrieve a JWT token, the JWT token is going to be self-contained. So it is basically stateless, which means that the JWT token contains all the information already inside. But it is created and signed with a private key that is stored on our authorization server. But the authorization server also provides a public key. When we want to deconstruct the JWT token, we need to call our authorization server and get the public key, which we can cache and save on our authorization server afterwards. And this way we can extract our JWT tokens, extract the scopes and the information we need to validate the user request. On the other hand, if we use an Opaque token, short Opaque, I'm going to write it like this. This token is going to have a short structure. It is going to be a hash. And in order to extract the information, we would need to call on each call the authorization server to check the token. So it is not self-contained. It is just a short string of 32 to 64 characters. And with that, we are going to call the authorization server and then allow the further processing of the request, whilst with the JWT token, we only need to call the authorization server once to get the public key, and afterwards we can always deconstruct it right on the resource server. So this is something to take into consideration depending if you want stateless or stateful communication, and if this is going to represent a bottleneck in your application. So the next part are scopes. You can use different scopes to retrieve different information. Normally, OpenID is something that we use with OAuth. OpenID is going to take care of the user information. And the user information is normally contained in the ID token. So you need to remember that the payload that we receive from the token endpoint is going to contain different information like an expiration date. It is going to contain scopes and, depending on your authorization server, some other metadata. So normally in the auth token, you're going to have the scopes and the metadata that comes with that token. So you're not going to have any user-specific information. If you want user-specific information, you would need to specify OpenID on this first call here. You would need to specify the scopes that you want to have, and then you would also retrieve a token ID. And that token ID is going to include information about the user, like username, maybe an image, avatar, email address, and so on and so forth. But you will also need to specify those as separate scopes like profile, email, username, and so on. So this is a very basic example where a lot of different things are put together. So if this topic is interesting and you would like to learn more about it, let me know down in the comments, or any questions and uncertainties that you have, just write them down in the comments, or go to noveltechmedia.com and contact me over there. So thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.